Today I'm going to be discussing a topic that I don't feel many Jamaicans are really focusing on. And this is the reality that energy, in terms of the security of our energy in the event of a natural event, such as hurricanes, we are not really becoming, in my view, aggressive enough as an entire nation to try and safeguard it. The reality, this is the video that I'm focused on, and then potential solutions. We're going to talk about that. But in terms of the risks, I'm going to save that for another series of videos because it's going to make it a little bit too long. But Jamaica, the fact is, as the Jamaica Public Service has indicated in their article, the reality of renewables is not sufficient to sustain the country in hurricanes. That is a very significant reality because, in the sense of it all, we are pushing solar, we are pushing wind as examples, and here it is as is being highlighted. Those are not sufficient. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to highlight what it is that this article by the Jamaica Observer is indicating, and then I'm going to revolve it a bit around the reality, and obviously looking at it a little bit into the solutions. So as per the Jamaica Observer article on March 22nd, 2026, Jamaica's push towards renewable energy faces a critical limitation during extreme weather events, with the JPS warning that solar, wind, and battery systems cannot sustain the electricity grid during hurricanes. During Hurricane Melissa, a fundamental reality occurred. When storms hit, the power system depends heavily on traditional dispatchable generation. The experience has reinforced the need for a more diversified approach to energy and infrastructure planning, Mr. Grant said, arguing that resilience cannot be built around a single technology or renewables. Too much of any one thing is not a resilient solution. And I will say that I agree. Beyond the physical challenges, the storm has exposed a widening gap in how disaster recovery is financed. Existing mechanisms, including the Electricity Disaster Fund, have proven insufficient to cover the scale of damage caused by major events. So at this point, a question has to be asked. Since Hurricane Melissa, is it established and communicated to the Jamaican public by the government of Jamaica that, let's just say, some form of adjustments have been put in place to ensure that financing brought into the Electricity Disaster Fund is much more sustainable for these larger scale events? I mean, more likely, yes, we would have heard about the risk transfer vehicles that exist, and those would have been mentioned by the Minister of Arts. But in this context, is it a case that that has been put in place? Those systems in place to ensure that the Electricity Disaster Fund, as an example, is on a much grand scale being financed to support Jamaica in the event of future events such as Hurricane Melissa. The article continues. The remarks point to a growing tension in Jamaica's energy transition as policymakers push towards a target of 50% renewable energy by 2030, even as the operator signals the limit of intermittent energy during extreme weather events. Mr. Grant said that while renewable energy remains central to the country's long-term strategy, it must be integrated alongside more resilient sources of generation capable of operating through extreme conditions. So, as you can hear, even though, yes, we should be pushing towards renewables, the reality for Jamaica is that we should ensure that we have within our energy mix, let's say, fossil fuels that can be able to withstand extreme weather events to power the generators. As Mr. Grant highlights, you are depending on a dispatchable resource, not an intermittent resource. And the dispatchable resource is fossil-based generation, noting that battery storage technologies remain limited in duration, or in other words, renewables as the source of energy for batteries, they are limited during these kind of events. Note this part, the longest term battery storage you have right now is approximately 8 hours at utility scale. That is the best and latest of the technology, as stated by Mr. Grant. And this section of the article explains why. When you have a hurricane, renewables are unavailable. Days prior to the hurricane, there was no solar. During the hurricane, no solar. After the hurricane, some was destroyed and it took time for it to get back online. Wind is secured for safety reasons and is also unavailable during hurricanes. And I should add, for those of you who probably will be thinking, what about hydro? Well, as you should know, during hurricanes, then we're talking about river systems being at swell. And it's also a case that the same river systems could create too much of a degree of stress on the energy generation power systems within the hydro stations themselves overall. So, in essence, they too can become hampered or severely hampered during hurricanes. So, as you can see, with this reality, it does appear to be very grim in terms of Jamaica's sustainable energy security as we speak right now, because we cannot necessarily say that as a nation, renewables is the solution entirely, even though we're blessed with our location that presents us with an abundance of solar, an abundance of wind, and to some degree even water. These sources of energy during events, weather events such as hurricanes, are intermittent and are not as reliable as fossil fuels. And this too is presenting the challenge to the angle of, let's just say, having those millennial development goals where we're talking about reducing fossil fuel usage, that kind of a thing. At the end of the day, fossil fuels, it can't go away if what it is that Mr. Grant is saying actually has to hold. Because when you think about the reality that climate change is here to stay, we have to still use fossil fuels to power our nations through these, events, extreme events, and assist the nation in recovery post these events. Now, with this being said, obviously we are looking at how we can be able to safeguard our nation and what about underground. And this is where, as Mr. Grant indicated, going underground can present us with the cost of at least 15 times the cost of having our energy supplied by, let's just say, the power lines above ground. That is very, very, very significant because, as is indicated right there, costs would have to be shared across all sectors. So, in essence, going underground, even if it's going to be on a limited scale, inflation would have to rise. So, in essence, that more than likely is not going to be the most preferred option by the policymakers at this time. This is a very sticky situation for the country. So, what is a solution? Well, it's obvious that at the very minimum, how I see it still, from a bottom up approach, households have to now think about really investing in their own sources of renewable energy. That is one, because at the very minimum, if it's a case that, yes, we do experience a degree of setback by, let's just say, the power grid, national power grid, being hampered and then now have to be offline for quite some time, that at the very minimum, we may have at the household level access to energy to, supply our immediate needs within the short term. In essence, this can be as used as a buffer to, I would say, go against or fight the reality of economic unproductivity when it's a case that we're talking about the national grid being offline for quite some time. So solar, or having any other form of renewable energy, for those of us who can, let's just say, invest in other means, that is a way to go. But definitely we would have to look at the cost of doing this, yes. And when we talk about hundreds of thousands of dollars for investing in our solar panels, and then we have to think about the whole angle of how we're going to ensure that during the extreme weather events we safeguard it to prevent any form of damage. That too would have to be on par, right? And then we have to look into the reality that with many of our nationals having been set back, especially in the western section of the island, months without any form of economic activity, and then just getting themselves back on their feet. investing in solar before, let's just say, the start of the 2026 hurricane season, or even any other applicable hurricane season for that matter, may be a challenge. So I understand that what it is that I'm saying may not really be applicable for everyone as we speak. But this is definitely me saying that this should be something that everyone aspires to, and as such, takes the necessary steps towards making it become a reality, whether it be in a year from now or so, because the situation exists that Jamaica cannot rely entirely on renewables. So, with this being said, we then now have to look at, yes, a long-term strategy. Long-term strategy will still speak to us having to explore the underground. This is now where, yes, we have to talk about what are some of those risks and how we can be able to go around some of these risks. And I'm going to be trying to present some of these in other videos in this respect. But at this juncture, this is the current reality for Jamaica, and this is a solution I have. So my question is posed to you now. What other solution do you think Jamaica can put in place to assist itself in creating a buffer for the people at a household community scale in the event of another major event, weather event system that can significantly affect, a significant portion of Jamaica? Looking forward to your comments.